Welcome to Swami Reacts, and today we will be exploring Etty Hillesum, A Life Transformed. This is a beautiful book I recently read. In my recent visit to Glastonbury, UK, I had the fortune of actually meeting the author of the book, Patrick Woodhouse. He took us on a beautiful tour or pilgrimage, I shall say, to the Wells Cathedral, very beautiful place in the area. Then I had the chance of visiting him at his home. We are developing a beautiful friendship. And this book is, I don't have words for that. It's incredible, remarkable to say the least. Not only, of course, the life of Etty Hillesum, a life transforming and transformed life, but also how it was crafted and presented and reflected upon. It is not just a Holocaust story, another Holocaust story. It's just not spiritual biography, so to say. It's, I will say, manual of what it means to let yourself be utterly transformed while history is collapsing around you, which makes it all the more contrasting and remarkable. So this book is based on the famous, or not yet so famous that they should deserve, diaries, entries of Etty Hillesum, including the main parts of those diaries, but also including very valuable, in my opinion, reflections and contemplations from the author, Patrick Woodhouse. So for those who are not yet so familiar with Etty Hillesum, she was born in Holland, born into a chaotic, dysfunctional Jewish family, not practitioners of the Jewish spiritual path, but Jewish by birth, of course. She was born in the Netherlands in 1914. How was her early life? Well, as the book describes very interestingly, emotionally unstable it was, sexually restless, spiritually lost, to say the least, in the beginning of her journey. She came from no religious background, no actual practicing environment. She had two brothers who were diagnosed eventually with schizophrenia. And at one point she calls the house in which she was born and raised a madhouse. Just for us to have an idea where she was born and how this beautiful heroine's journey starts to unfold from such an environment. And yet in 2 years, as we will see, and at the book very beautifully depicts, in just 2 years, this same woman born from such a womb, so to say, with such wounds, will become in many ways spiritual torchlight, an anchor in a Nazi transit camp, choosing not to hide, not to hate, and above all not to despair, not to lose hope, but to love and to do love deeply. So in Etty Hillesum's case, her transformation was not gradual, as usually we hear in most people's journey. It was very sudden. It took place in a short amount of time. We could say it was volcanic, basically. And again, it didn't happen despite the war that was taking place, of course, World War, Nazi, Holocaust regime, but because of how she met with all of that from within, with utter intensity, depth, presence, embracing of everything, accommodation, integrating enough spaciousness to allow everything to take place in her heart and accommodating that in the context of love. So again, she was born Jewish, not from a practicing family, but she had very interesting, not only intellectual, but inner curiosities in terms of exploring traditions as it happened in time. She will go to the New Testament, to the Psalms, to the Quran. Rilke's poetry was one of her main readings and inspirations. Russian authors like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, St. Augustine, poetry, prayer eventually became so crucial as there are her daily inner meal, so to say. Beyond doctrine, beyond dogma, beyond religious institutional affiliation, really an outside of the box interesting person. She never joined a church. She never was officially affiliated with any of the major religions we know. She never formally converted, and I highlight formally because she indeed went through a very deep conversion. She never submitted to a religious authority, as sometimes we may think that's the norm, that's what's required. And yet in the end, despite of this, so to say, in many ways she was more spiritually awake than most cardinals, rabbis, swamis, teachers, or robed clergy we may meet sometimes in our lives. So this reminds to me how bhakti in our tradition, Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, how the path of love, the sacred path of loving devotion, often emerges outside the institutions that try to contain it or that try to present it. I have nothing against institutions, but we all know its limitations and its pros and cons. So many times the real fervor and ultimate passion of divine love needs to break with some of those boundaries. The gopis of Vrindavan in our tradition will be a beautiful example of that. Transgressing all sense of dharma, all sense of religion for the sake of the ultimate dharma religion, passionate communion with the divine. The gopis didn't go through any formal religious education, upayanas, ceremonies, rituals, but they burned with love. And so did Etty Hillesum. Her turning point, as the book describes, happened or began to happen in 1941. If I'm not mistaken, she was 27 at that time, when she entered Jungian therapy with Julius Speyer, who eventually became her therapist, friend, spiritual companion, and sometimes even her lover. So through this relationship, which really marked her and created a before and after that chapter, she began to confront her shadow. She began to confront all the wound and the unresolved inner stuff, the inner storm she was carrying. And she began a very, again, volcanic, fast journey of transformation, redemption. Gradually, she discovered a center inside of her, towering center, a place of quiet, unshakable awareness. And she eventually called it God. But by God, she didn't refer to a bearded man in a distant sky, but the deepest and most essential part inside of her and inside each of us. She will say, God is what is deepest and best in me and in others and in everyone else. So again, this mirrors a deep Gaudiya Vaishnava insight, which is the soul, the jiva, the Atman, is not entirely separate from God. We are individuals, but we are not separable from the divine, but an intimate part of the wholeness that divinity is. Meant to love, meant to serve, even in suffering, especially in those moments. For me personally, of course, I was touched by many parts of the book, by many parts of the journey of Etty. And this is just a summary, please, just an appetizer to tempt each one of you to go and dive deep into the work. But one of the most powerful scenes in her story, as narrated in the book, is her kneeling down, which eventually became a crucial part of her daily sadhana. Not in any mechanical way, but as a very necessary inner call to kneel down in prayer, in deep presence. She describes her kneeling down happening in the bathroom, on the rough coconut matting of her bathroom, daily resorting there, finding shelter, finding communion there, praying deeply. Again, as a Jew, that was not part of her own upbringing, but slowly she somehow trained herself in the vulnerability of surrender and developed a taste for that sense of intimacy. And her moments of intimacy in prayer were so paradoxically embarrassing for her. She, at one point of the book, she says, like, this act of kneeling down in prayer is even more intimate than sex, which sometimes we may think that's the ultimate intimacy. And that life, to me, it stopped me basically, because I always like to think about sexuality in terms of intimacy, and not only in terms of the biological act, but in terms of the sexual energy we all have, we need to express properly in terms of creativity, relationality, connectedness, intimacy. And we are living in a hyper-sexualized culture. And because of this, we often forget that true intimacy is not just putting two bodies together. That does not necessarily amount to true intimacy. True intimacy is surrender. And you can surrender your body, your soul, your heart in union with a beloved one, even in a sexual act. But surrender must be there for intimacy to be there. So therefore, true surrender, true devotion, true love, one says, is to kneel down before the fire of life. Not just survive it, but to kneel down in full surrender, as Etty beautifully did. Another very related aspect of it that her kneeling down on her prayer took her more and more is her refusal to hate. Refusing to hate whatever came to her life. And you can try to travel in time and picture the environment in which she was in, the context of the Nazi regime. Hatred surrounded her and everything and everyone. And in return to that, many times her Jewish friends also spoke about the Nazis with rage and hate, fear, bitterness. And I can understand that. But Etty refused to join any of those parties of hate, basically. Not because she was naive, not because she didn't know what was going on. She was a very intelligent lady. But because she knew that hatred, in response to hatred, will deform her soul, will not add to the solution of the problem. And she wrote, and there have some quotes from the book, even the worst crimes, I try to look them in the eye and find the small, naked human being beneath the wreckage. So she didn't believe in souls that are inherently evil. She knew besides these symptoms in the form of evil, cruelty, atrocity, there is a broken human being. And even in the worst sins, I tried to see that. Very close again to our Gaudiya Vaishnava vision, trying to see the bright soul, its bright potential, many times, especially when that's not apparent to our outer eye. Even in the distorted, even in the broken, even in the horror, not lose sight of beauty, not lose sight of bright potential, not to excuse anything and everything, but to refuse to dehumanize others, to dehumanize ourselves in the context of dehumanizing others. Another interesting point in the book is that Etty refused to not only to hate, but she refused to hide. She was offered the opportunity of escape, the potential end that many Jews ended up in the form of dying in the concentration camps. She had multiple chances of doing so, like many Jews had the chance of doing, thousands of them, but she said no, interestingly. Why? According to the author Patrick Woodhouse, she will say, for Etty, to hide will be to succumb to fear. If I'm hiding, means I'm fearful. I'm embracing fear. To hide will mean not to share the faith of her people, the Jewish community. To hide will mean to abandon her vocation, probably most importantly of all, to serve, which was her vocation, to serve others with love, to give hope, and to bear witness. To refuse to hide, to refuse to look in another direction. She, at one point, she mentioned something like, I will be the thinking heart or beating heart of the barracks. In the context of such horror, she embodied that beacon light of hope. Very related to the notion of bodhisattva, right? The refusal to attain liberation, but remaining with the suffering ones in our world. A sadhu ideally refers to that. One who stands in the fire not to escape, but to illuminate. As the Bhagavad Gita says, ones for whom others' suffering become one's own. Embracing to that degree of empathy, of tadatmya. And a few more thoughts that come to my mind. One of those being one of the most radical and therefore famous things that Etty Hillesum ever wrote was when she spoke to God and saying, God cannot help us. We must help him. We must protect his dwelling place inside of us. That's a very interesting koan-like line. God cannot help us. We must help him. We must protect his dwelling place inside of us. No? She felt that God was being forgotten. in the concentration camps, not in philosophical terms, but in human conduct. How we behave does not represent God's existence, how we are made in the image of the divine, so to say. So she watched that as people were storing silverware instead of preserving their compassion or humanity many times. So Etty's words teach us again not to love God just as our protector because he's protecting us only because of that I love you, but paradoxically, she's teaching a very unique lesson in the realm of unconditional love, how to become a protector of God's own heart, even when he seems absent. It's not that she concluded she was absent, but even when we perceive the divine to be absent, how to tend to God's heart. In our own tradition, we have our own way of speaking about that, but still the principle is there. The goal of life is not only to help others and help ourselves, of course, but to include God in that equation, paradoxically. Who we are to do that, but that's the arrangement, to tend to God's heart in a very unique way. So in 1943, Etty Hillesum voluntarily entered Westbrook, who was a Nazi transit camp toward Auschwitz, and began caring for the sick, for the old, for the broken. And people who witnessed her, who saw her, and who survived the camp, of course, say that she radiated calm, sparked joy, presence, hope, even as the trains will take her friends away and so many other people. And she made very detailed descriptions, heartbreaking ones, of course, of babies being torn from their cribs and mothers being shoved onto cattle cars. And still she wrote, and let me read this for you. At night, I walk along the barbed wire with a spring in my step. I cannot help it. It's just the way it is. Life is glorious and magnificent, and one day we will build a whole new world. So she said all that in the context of the Nazi regime. She still saw magnificence and beauty. She saw a bigger picture. She died in Auschwitz. She was taken to the concentration camp, but her soul, despite dying, she was not defeated by the Holocaust. She triumphed over it. Her soul knelt down in life, to life, again and again. And in that kneeling down, she stood taller than any emperor, any evil that we could possibly think of. So Etty Hillesum's diaries are still relatively unknown. This is my small effort to make them a little bit more known to the world. And despite them being unknown, her voice burns with the power of other Holocaust famous participants, so to say, like Anne Frank and her diaries. Her voice burns with the clarity of someone like Viktor Frankl. And in many ways, her voice burns with the mysticism and compassion of all the great saints. She was an out-of-the-box, inter-spiritual, modern personality, and yet very ancient, very deep, very wise. And in an age we are living today, postmodern or post-postmodern age of meaning crisis, meaning lacking, digital addiction, ideological warfare, and whatnot, I'll say she, in the context of all that, she's teaching us how to remain human. One of the most important gifts and assets we are called to preserve in the current age we are living. Also, on top of that, she's showing us the real sainthood. It has nothing to do with institution, with title, with dogma. It has everything to do with presence, with kneeling, with refusing to hate, and loving and listening to God within. So please do yourself a favor. Go through this beautiful work, Etty Hillesum, A Life Transformed by Patrick Woodhouse. Read her story. It's not just a story, it's an invitation. And then maybe you can ask yourself, as a little homework for each one of us, where in my life am I being called to kneel down? Or what does it mean to protect God inside me when the world is growing cold? Or what does love look like when it costs everything? So if you have read the book, please share your comments below. And if you hadn't, do yourself a favor, go through it, know about the wonderful life of Etty Hillesum. And until next time, stay human, stay loving, stay